Edward was used to the fact that nothing in life was as easy as he would have liked it to be. He had to break through many problems and trials, but all this allowed him to come to real happiness. Ed was not born into the most prosperous family. He did not know his father, but his mother often mentioned him in not the best context. For a while, the boy tried to find out some information about him, but in vain. Edward's mother, Mrs. Julia, didn't lead a very good life. She lived with Ed in a small house, almost on the outskirts of the village, which was not easy to get to. But despite this, the guy tried to keep a positive attitude and not to give up. But the older he got, the harder it became to do so. After all, now the problems had to be solved by him, not by his mother. Already at the age of 15, Edward faced childish cruelty. On another school day, he was running a little late, entering the classroom after the bell had rung. "Sorry I'm late." The boy spoke quickly, heading for his seat in the classroom. However, the teacher did not let him do that, but spoke threateningly. "Edward, stand at the blackboard." The boy slowly turned around, stopping in place and looking at the teacher. "Why do you even go to class? If you're going to have the same fate as your mother, what's the point of attending class, taking up my time, if you have absolutely no chance at a normal future?" At this moment, the laughter of the back desks in the classroom erupted. After a few seconds of silence, the sarcastic voice of one of his classmates rang out. "With his looks like that, he's the only way to go. Who would want him like that? Look at him. He looks like a bum, and he smells like one too." The classmate laughed. A few more people laughed after him. An atmosphere of hatred and humiliation prevailed in the classroom. "That's right. Why even bother teaching him with us? He annoys me. He's always looking in my notebooks and spoiling my appetite in the school cafeteria," one of her classmates said. Edward was visibly embarrassed, and it was the cause of another wave of ridicule. "Kick him out of our class altogether. Why does he have to come to school and embarrass us all? They'll say he's a bum in our class." "Exactly. No intelligence, no imagination, nothing to suggest that he should be in the same class with us. Get him out of here, get him out of here." "What are you waiting for, Mrs. Clara?" exclaimed one of the classmates. And at that moment the teacher realized that the situation was completely out of control. But she took her time and quieted everyone down. After a few minutes of bullying, Edward couldn't stand it. He bellowed at his classmates. "Why the hell do you put yourselves above me? You've accomplished nothing in this life. Everything you have was given to you by your parents. You're nothing. You are even worse than me, because I never let myself bully the weaker ones." The boy ran his eyes around the class, stopping his gaze on one of his classmates who was hurling insults at him. "Okay, they're the ones who are inconsiderate. But how could you stoop to that level? You were poor just a few years ago. I protected you from ridicule, from the bullies who didn't let you walk home in peace. What makes you think you've suddenly become a better person?" He shifted his gaze to a classmate at the other end of the class. "Have you forgotten how I helped your parents renovate? I plowed your house from morning till night to help rebuild it after the high winds that destroyed it. And I didn't charge a dime for all the work I did, even though I could have." The boy exhaled convulsively, trying to calm down, and then looked around at his classmates. He shook his head tiredly, adding, "I've helped many of you in a difficult situation, and this is your thanks. You know, I probably don't have as much money as you do. I don't have a big house and a dad with a cool car. I don't have expensive clothes. I don't have a cell phone, but I have something more valuable. A humanity that you don't have. I'm withdrawing from this class myself because I find you all extremely distasteful. It's a shame I've spoiled your moods and your lives with my presence all these years. Have a good day." Edward left the office. He held back the traitorous tears that were already gathering in the corners of his eyes. He couldn't show his weaknesses so easily, couldn't admit that he was hurting from the decision he'd made. He realized that now his childhood was finally over, and he had to start making his way in the world somehow, to secure a better future for himself. But if he had known how it would all end. A few weeks passed. The boy did not go to school and stubbornly avoided this topic of conversation. He didn't want to clear things up with his mother, to make her aware of what had happened. Ed seriously thought about finding a job and even began to go through numerous options. But he was often rejected because of his age or the fact that he did not look the most appropriate way. After almost a month of constant searching, he came across an offer that seemed promising. It only included an address, and for a long time Ed was hesitant to respond to such offers at all. Several days passed, and there were no other job offers. No one called back, although some employers promised to do so. The degree of despair was getting stronger and stronger because there was no money in the family even for food. The boy's mother continued to drink, and every year the amount of alcohol consumed only became more and more. The woman was fired from work. She received unemployment benefits, but it was so meager that Mrs. Julia often went begging. Against this backdrop, Ed was constantly arguing with his mother. "How much money can you spend on your own amusements?" Ed exclaimed as he watched his mother bring home more bottles. "How many times can you embarrass me? Do you have any idea what they say about us?" The boy shouted, not holding back his emotions at all. "Why did I get a mother like you? Why couldn't I have a normal mother?" In an instant, Julia's gaze changed. She looked at her son with anger, and then she spoke irritably. "I don't have to be what you want me to be. I gave birth to you. That's it. You can make your own way in this life as you wish. I don't care where you go, what happens to you. And if you don't like it, just get out. Pack your stuff. Get the hell out of here. Nobody's keeping you here, and nobody's going to talk you into staying home. Do you understand?" The woman spoke calmly, but there was so much venom and hatred in her voice that the boy felt uncomfortable. He flinched, but forced himself to stay where he was, realizing that he couldn't show weakness. After a few seconds of complete silence, the woman went into another room, leaving her son alone with his thoughts. In the meantime, Edward's mind was in complete chaos, and all his thoughts came to one thing. He needed to leave as soon as possible. Ed had stopped talking to his own mother. He avoided her at all costs and did his best not to hear from her. But one way or another there were whispers, and there were taunts behind his back. The guy took even the smallest part-time jobs to get even the slightest hope that he could move to some other place. But too soon he began to rejoice. Not only that most of the money was spent on groceries and basic things, without which it is simply impossible to live, but also one day in the house of the guy visited the inspection. It was an ordinary weekday morning, Monday or Tuesday. Ed himself did not remember what kind of day it was. After another night shift on unloading a truck, the guy was powerlessly asleep when he heard a persistent knock on the door. Slightly opened his eyes. He prayed that his mother herself got up and opened the door, which so insistently knocked. But he soon realized that he shouldn't count on such a thing. Ed got out of bed heading for the door, not even realizing what awaited him behind it. When he opened the door, the guy froze on the threshold in bewilderment. Behind the door stood a woman in a business suit and a policeman. They scrutinized the guy, after which the woman calmly spoke. "I understand, Edward. It's you. Is that right? I need to talk to your mother before I make a final decision about sending you to an orphanage. May I see her?" The woman looked inside. Realizing how much of a mess it was, her gaze became more serious and heavy. She spoke in an uncertain voice. "Excuse me, do you live here alone or with your parents? Judging by the state of the house, there is no point in discussing any issues with your official representative. The living conditions are completely substandard. Pack your things, Edward." The boy stood at a loss. He had expected anything but this. His thoughts were frantically changing from one to the other. There was no trace of his previous sleepiness. Ed realized that if he got to the orphanage, he could forget about all his plans and aspirations. "Excuse me, why do you want to take me to an orphanage? I've been living in this environment for 15 years, and just now, when I'm old enough to be on my own, you want to take me away? For what? What's the point?" Edward decided to go for the attack tactic. He realized there was no point in making excuses. He had no idea where his mother was, and he realized that admitting it would mean being sent to an orphanage. The woman didn't seem at all embarrassed by the boy's question. She remained calm and unwavering as she answered him. "Because we have only been notified that there are problems in your family. We don't come unless there's an obvious reason, Edward. But what makes you think I have a problem? You've come at a time in my life when there's no trace of the problems I had before. I don't think there's any point in this anymore. Take care of the other children." Edward tried to close the door, but the police officer stopped his attempt with a swipe of his hand. The man walked into the room without saying anything or asking permission. He stopped a meter away from the boy, letting the woman from the guardianship office go forward. She looked around and began to write something down in her notebook, as if not surprised at all. Edward frantically tried to justify the mess. "We're just doing a general cleanup. That's all the stuff out of its place. We don't do that very often, actually. We usually keep things in order and try to clean almost every day." Ed followed the woman, praying that his mother wasn't home. "Edward, what did you have for breakfast today and what will you have for lunch? I need to see your food supplies and schedule what you're being fed." The woman went in the direction of the kitchen, but the boy instantly blocked her way. He looked the woman in the eye and spoke hastily. "Don't worry, I eat very well. My mom is a very good cook. There's no need for you to check my refrigerator." The woman only looked at the boy with a displeased look, then replied in the same calm voice, "I'm sorry, but I can't do otherwise. I have to do it according to the regulations. I'll just write down everything you have in your refrigerator and we'll go back to this room." The checker walked around the guy. Edward realized that at this point it was possible to put an end to his ingenious plan. The woman walked into the kitchen, and immediately there was an exclamation. "Woman, who are you? Why are you in the kitchen like that?" Some kind of commotion was heard from the room, and after a few seconds the inspector returned to the room. She looked at the guy with displeasure for a few seconds, and then spoke. "I understand that this is your mother, who is a great cook. You know, honey, I think you should pack your things. We can't leave you in this environment. It's not good for you and it's not good for your psyche. You have 20 minutes to pack anything you might need at the orphanage. But the number of things is limited, so take only the essentials." The woman's gaze was completely serious. She looked carefully at Edward, who was looking around nervously. "Okay. Yeah. I'll be right there. Quickly." The boy headed swiftly for the other room, realizing that he just didn't have much choice or time to think. After a few seconds of hesitation, he opened the window and started climbing out. And just when it seemed that freedom was near, he heard footsteps behind him and the voice of the very woman who was checking him out. "Ed, I forgot to tell you." At that moment the woman had already come to the entrance of the room and saw the guy's attempted escape. "Joe, we've got another guy who thinks he can escape." A second later, a precinct officer came running into the room. But at that moment, Ed had already climbed out the window. It was quite small, so the guy was sure the man wouldn't get through. And so he did. Having estimated his size, the policeman rushed to the exit of the house. But at that moment, Ed was already rushing away. He did not turn around, hearing the man continuing to run after him. For a moment he thought he was about to be caught. The boy's strength was failing him. It was getting harder and harder to run, especially after a hard night shift at work. At one moment the guy tripped over something and fell a few meters, after which he covered his head with his hands and shouted, "Don't touch me, I'm not going anywhere. I would rather live on the street than agree to an orphanage." He shouted as hard as he could until he realized that there was complete silence around him. Cautiously opening his eyes, he saw that there was no one around. He was sitting alone in an area of good grass that was completely unfamiliar to him. Continuing to listen, he slowly got up from the ground, trying to figure out where he was. But it was all in vain. A completely unfamiliar place in a village he had never been to before. There was no choice, and the boy moved in roughly the same direction he had come from to find his way back. But there was no way to find it. Only after half an hour he was able to come to a more or less familiar street. What to do now? Where to go? Should he try to go home? No, definitely not. They would definitely be on duty there to take him to the orphanage. But what to do now? Ed just didn't have any other places to stay, even for a while. No friends, no acquaintances, no one at all. It seemed to him that the whole world was set against him, and the problems were growing like a snowball, from which there was simply no escape. His feet were wandering in an unknown direction. Several times the guy stopped to at least try to understand where he was. After a couple of hours of such wandering, he reached the very place where he was once offered a dubious job. "Have you changed your mind and decided to come to us?" Suddenly a voice came from behind him. He flinched, realizing that he had entered private territory and that he wasn't exactly welcome here. The feeling of dread was slowly creeping up, but it was incomparable to the hopelessness that raged in Edward's soul. He lowered his head tiredly and spoke. "I have nowhere to go. I'd lost my last one today." What was I supposed to do? I just don't know how or why I can go on living. The boy's voice trembled. No matter how strong he tried to sound, he'd been broken inside for a long time, and it was only more so now. Mr. Arthur. Yea. The boy hesitated. He didn't want to agree to a dubious offer just to make money. It seemed to him that something was amiss here. His inner voice shouted that he should leave, but Ed continued to stand still and stare into the eyes of the tall man. After a few seconds, Arthur came over to the boy, patted him on the shoulder, saying with a sort of fatherly, gentle timbre in his voice, "Don't worry, son. We all have hard times. We all started somewhere, and we all have to work hard to make something of our lives. I myself started at the bottom and worked my way up through the ranks. I know how difficult and painful it is and how long it takes for all the wounds to heal. But we are all human beings, and there are those among us who are ready to lend a helping hand. I am one of them." The man smiled, patting the boy on the shoulder once more. In some strange way, such a simple action had a calming effect on Ed. It seemed like everything was really going to be okay now. All it would take was a little more time and things would get better. "You can stay with me for a while until you make some money and find an apartment to rent. Maybe if you're lucky, you can even move to the city and keep working for me. There's always plenty of work, boy. I don't hurt my guys with the pay, so you don't have to worry. It'll be just like I told you. You'll just have to sign a contract stating that you have no right to tell anyone about your work or talk about it in any way." At that moment, Ed tensed up. That was the main reason he had refused Arthur's offer. It seemed to him that such contracts were only made if something outrageous was going to be done, something he didn't want to be a part of. But there wasn't much choice. I mean, staying on the street wasn't exactly the best option. But I can leave work for you at any time, right? Right? Like you told me, if I don't like something, we'll just cancel the contract and go our separate ways like ships at sea. Isn't that right? I don't want to work for you for the rest of my life. I still have some plans and ambitions. Do you understand?" Edward looked at his potential employer in disbelief. Arthur smiled, and there was something predatory and smug in that simple gesture. He scrutinized the boy from head to toe once more, as if to make sure he was the right man for the job. Then he spoke. "Of course, no one will force anyone to work. As soon as you realize you want to leave or just do something else, or you realize you've made enough money, you can leave without asking anyone for anything. Just tell me your decision. That's all." Ed stared at the man in disbelief for a few more seconds, then nodded uncertainly. It seemed that of all the evils, this was turning out to be the least of them. If he'd known how he'd end up agreeing to work for a questionable man, he would have thought twice before agreeing. Arthur offered Ed a small room to stay in. It was more like a closet in size, but it had a bed and a small dresser, and that was enough to accommodate him comfortably. He looked at the man and spoke thoughtfully. "Do I owe you something for letting me in to live in it temporarily?" "Son, it's just a gesture of human kindness. Since you're in a difficult situation, I thought I'd help you out for nothing." Arthur looked around the room thoughtfully, then spoke excitedly. "When we sign the contract for work, I'll bring you up to speed, tell you about what and how it will be carried out. And tomorrow you can already start working so as not to waste time, so that you earn faster and start earning and can at least put something aside for a rainy day, like this one." The man looked at the boy, noticing his confusion. It was obvious that the guy hesitated to make a decision in such a short time. So Arthur decided to press him. "It's just that I only have a couple of slots left, and if they're taken, it's unlikely I'll be able to wedge you into the jobs in the long run." The man shrugged, trying to make the situation less tense, and he succeeded. Edward realized that he didn't have a chance to think about it for a long time, to hesitate. So he spoke immediately. "Let's decide in a couple hours. We've been knocked off our feet. How about we decide everything first and then you can go to sleep? It'll make you sleep better, won't it? And not just a couple hours of sleep, but a good full night's rest. I'll prepare all the documents now and we can quickly study all the points so you can sign the contract. Wait a couple minutes." Arthur walked briskly out of the room, his footsteps growing distant. Edward stared after him for a few seconds, then began to look around the room. At some point he felt like he was in a cage that was impossible to get out of. The air felt heavy. At some point Ed even felt a slight dizziness, from which he sat down on the bed. It creaked unpleasantly, which made goosebumps run down the guy's back. Looking around, he decided to look into the dresser and immediately recoiled from it before he could touch it. There were scratches on the surface of the furniture, or run. Something inside clenched unpleasantly at the realization that the decision he'd made might have been wrong. I wanted to run away, and such a thought even flashed through the boy's mind. But at that moment he heard footsteps rapidly approaching. He flinched the moment Arthur entered the room. He happily held out a pen to Ed, saying, "Here's the pen, here's the papers, you can sign. Then I'll tell you briefly what will be required of you and you can rest. We'll start work tomorrow so you'll be awake and able to do it properly." The man looked at Edward carefully. I don't know why he's hesitating. The boy stared at the papers in disbelief, not sure what to do. Some inarticulate fear was growing stronger and stronger. "Excuse me, but can I think about your offer? I'll look at the contract, read the documents, so that I have at least a rough idea of what I'll be facing. I'd hate to sign without reading." Despite the fact that the boy did not say anything objectionable, the man's face changed dramatically. Arthur rapidly shortened the distance between him and the boy, glaring at Ed with displeasure. His nostrils flared with displeasure, and there was genuine rage in his eyes. He waved the documents sharply in front of the guy's face, not taking his gaze off him, and a few seconds later he blurted out in an irritated voice, "Do you know how many people have already gone through this contract? And no one has ever given me any conditions or ultimatums. Everyone has always trusted me. How can you bite the hand that feeds you?" "Exactly, you can't." Arthur waved the documents in front of the boy's face once more, adding, "This is your last chance to have a normal life. No one will chase you, and no one will offer you a living. Good money with minimal conditions. If you refuse now, I won't offer you anything else." Edward looked at the man with incomprehension to understand why he was acting like this. After a few seconds, Arthur realized that the tactics he had chosen were not particularly effective. He immediately changed, making his face more distressed. He muttered, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have taken my anger out on you. It's just that I had an employee who also wanted to just read the contract, and then gave away all my peculiarities and intricacies of work to my competitors. I got into serious trouble after that. It took a few years to get everything back on track. I just can't take that kind of risk, so I prefer to sign all the documents as early as possible. I'll be sure to tell you everything afterward. You're not a little kid. You understand the risks I'm taking by hiring you. Not everything is rosy in this life. But who am I telling? You've been through a lot of betrayal and human malice yourself, and you realize that all my worries are not just out of nowhere. I need a guarantee that everything will be okay. So please, just sign the documents, and we will start discussing all the issues related to your work. Arthur slid the documents under the guy's nose. Edward struggled with his inner contradiction for a few seconds. On the one hand, the man seemed serious. There was no hint of a lie or anything like that in his voice. But on the other hand, something inside Ed himself was screaming that he shouldn't sign anything. Arthur's gaze was pressing, and the boy just couldn't resist it, leaving a stubby signature on the sheet. At that moment, the man smiled smugly. He immediately took the documents, sitting down on a free table, which stood almost near the door, and said in a satisfied voice, I didn't doubt you at all. I knew you were a very intelligent guy who could make the right decision. What's more, I'm sure you won't hurt me in my work. Now I need to tell you exactly what will be required of you and what you will be doing. The man leaned forward a little as if trying to make the atmosphere less oppressive and said, But don't worry, you can still learn everything. A new wave of goosebumps ran down the boy's back. He glanced at his new employer, asking uncertainly, Am I going to have to get used to something illegal? Ed looked at the man with incomprehension and anxiety, expecting to get a positive answer from him. But Arthur made such a surprised expression on his face that the guy was confused, lowering his eyes to the floor. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pick on you in any way. It's just that you're speaking in riddles, so I thought maybe. No, son, I don't do anything that's going to get me censured by society or in trouble with the law. You don't have to worry. No, all the work is completely legitimate. You're just going to be making deliveries. That's all. It's just that our clients are quite wealthy, and they need to make sure no one knows what you're leaving them. Arthur moved a little closer, looking into the guy's eyes and thus trying to make his words more convincing. You'll just need to transport the boxes from one warehouse to another at night so that no one can intercept you and track the car. And one more important point. With all cargoes, you need to be as careful and cautious as possible. Some of them turn out to be quite fragile, and if something happens in the process of transportation, you will pay from your own pocket. Do you understand? Edward nodded slowly, signaling that he was listening to his boss, and Arthur continued, basically, you won't have to drive. Your partner will do most of the driving. I'll introduce you to someone more experienced who will teach you everything, but you'll have to learn to drive, of course. There's no telling when you might need it. The man hesitated for a few seconds as if wondering if he should say anything more to Ed. You know, your job will be so easy that you won't even want to leave. Just don't let me down. Otherwise, you could get into a lot of trouble. You don't want that, do you? Yes? Ed waved his head in the negative, which brought another smile to Arthur's face. He patted Ed on the shoulder and walked out, taking the papers with him. At which point Ed muttered, "Excuse me, but aren't you going to leave the contract for me to read? I'd like to know what's required of me and how I'm going to work. Maybe there are some important things I should memorize?" "No," the man answered harshly, clutching the papers tighter in his hand. "You don't need those papers. You'll be brought up to speed on the job. You don't have to worry." Looking at the guy with displeasure and some irritation again, the man added, "Rest. You'll definitely need your strength to do the job." Arthur left the room, and at that moment a feeling of utter hopelessness came over the boy. He felt that he had made a mistake that he would regret more than once in the future, but he couldn't understand what exactly it was. Ed was introduced to Alex as a mentor, a sullen man who was not particularly happy about the change. At first glance, the man seemed angry, and Edward didn't want to be alone with him. But there was no choice. "Let's go," Alex bellowed, not even looking at the boy. "We're wasting time. I've got a lot of work to do. I've got a bunch of little kids coming to see me. I can't take it anymore." Ed obediently followed the man, listening to his discontent and numerous lamentations. It seemed that all further training would go exactly like this. But no. Alex stopped near a small hangar, turning around. "Ed, your part of the job will be to move all the boxes from the storage room to the car as quickly as possible. You have to be careful not to let any of them fall over. Otherwise, you and I will never pay for this merchandise for the rest of our lives. Arthur's not going to find out whose fault it was that the box fell. He'll just skin us both. That's pretty much the end of your role. Mostly all orders are done at night, very rarely in the early morning. So get used to sleeping during the day so you'll have enough energy for the next order. And if you screw up, you will not only be kicked out, but also hang a lot of compensation on you. So either leave with your head held high after all the work is done or work. That's it. Tonight you're going to carry boxes and I'm going to watch you do it. Tomorrow you can go out for your first order." Seeing the guy's stunned look, Alex hastened to add, "I don't have time to spend half my life teaching you. I have my own problems and things to do. I plan to spend no more than 1 day on you, kid. So it's either that or go to Arthur and arrange to get you another teacher. I'm not wasting my time on you." "But Arthur said I also have to learn to drive. Am I doing that today too? Is it possible to learn to drive a car like this in 1 day, when I've never even held a steering wheel?" the boy said with incomprehension, realizing that Alex was no less shocked himself. "Maybe, of course, I'll understand what and how, but not in a day. So what is it? I was told that you just needed to be brought up to speed. No one told me you'd have to learn anything beyond that. Driving's not like stacking boxes on top of boxes. You need experience. And given the fragility of the cargo we're carrying, I wouldn't let you drive. No way, to risk your own skin." Alex looked at the guy thoughtfully for a few seconds. Then he added, "I'll talk to the boss myself. You don't need to learn to drive too. It'll take a lot of time. Wait here." After that sentence, the man walked briskly toward the buildings where Arthur had gone a few minutes ago. Ed didn't know how long he'd been gone, but it felt like an eternity. The interior of the car was even hotter than it was outside. The small shade saved a little from the heat, but in the absence of water and food, the condition was not the most pleasant. Alex returned in a better mood. It could be assumed that the conversation had not gone well, but the man obviously did not plan to discuss it. He began to tell Ed how to set the boxes out properly, how many of them there should be in rows and in height, when it was better to stop so as not to damage the load, and so on. In a few minutes, Edward was already hauling boxes into the back of the vehicle, trying to remain as calm as possible. He was estimating the weight of each individual box to see where it should stand. So the whole day passed, and only after the sixth loading and unloading of the vehicle, Alex spoke in a calmer voice. "Well, the last time was pretty good. We can leave for today. Tomorrow we will go directly to the shift. At 8 o'clock in the evening you should be here. If you're late, I'll leave without you." Alex turned around and left without saying goodbye to the guy, leaving him in complete confusion. Ed thought for a few minutes whether it was worth making the last step, after which there would be no way to go back, or whether it was worth giving up before everything started. The next evening, Ed was already standing outside the car. He had made his choice and realized there might be consequences behind it. But the second 24 hours of starvation made it hard not to think about them. Ed was only worried about getting paid as quickly as possible and getting back to the room to eat. After a few minutes, Alex came over. Looking at his partner with disbelief, he moved closer and spoke in a quiet, almost inaudible voice. "I was sure you wouldn't come. But I was wrong. That's commendable." Alex smiled faintly, stepping closer to Edward. The pair went on the mission, and for the boy, it was one of the most exciting days of his life. After all, a whole new phase was now beginning. The boxes were being loaded from some warehouse that was located 100 kilometers away from the village. Almost the whole way the guys were silent, either because of the awkwardness of the first trip together, or because of the fact that because of the difference in generations, there were no topics for conversation. Only near the warehouse, Alex started to tell the guy what exactly he would have to do and to what extent. "And someone will meet us there, in this place, show us what we need to pick up and what we don't." Ed looked at Alex with incomprehension, who was very puzzled by his words. The man looked at the guy with incomprehension and then asked, "Do you even realize what we're doing? If someone comes out while we're moving the boxes into the car, we have to run right away. If we get caught, we'll be in even bigger trouble than from the boss for unfulfilled tasks." Alex looked at Edward with doubt and some irritation, who was shocked by his words. "Our job is to pick up boxes from other people's warehouses and bring them to ours. We don't buy the goods, we just pick them up when no one is there. We get the keys from those who choose to betray their employer for one reason or another, to hand over access to the warehouses. Don't tell me you thought that a job that pays so much money would be easy and safe." Alex spoke with undisguised frustration and irritation. A few seconds passed before he added, "Let's do it quickly. Then you'll think about what you did, and whether you did the right thing. You don't have a choice right now. You can't just set me up, so pack up and get out." Alex stopped the car a few meters from the entrance to the warehouse. Edward took a quick look around the area. No cameras, no dogs. It was clear that the place was deliberately chosen in such a way as to minimize all possible risks. The internal struggle was getting fiercer. The guy closed his eyes, trying to calm down and convince himself that he had no other option. After a few seconds, he opened his eyelids and swiftly stepped out of the cab of the transport, heading for Alex, who was already opening the lock diligently and quietly. As he approached the man, Edward spoke thoughtfully. "What happens if I turn down the job after this assignment? Would I be allowed to just walk away?" Ed stared intently at his partner, who didn't even turn in his direction after the question. "You can leave any time you pay the penalty. It's up to the boss. But I can tell you for sure that it's a big one, and one paycheck won't be enough for it." Alex looked at the guy for a moment, noticing the confusion in his eyes. He should have thought before signing the papers, agreeing to something. At that moment, the lock gave in and the door began to slowly open. There were 10 boxes in the storage room, which turned out to be quite impressive in weight. Overcoming his inner anxiety and fear, Edward began to carry the boxes from the storage room to the car, carefully arranging them as he had been shown earlier. A couple hours later, the car was full. It was time to depart. Ed glanced back, realizing that the warehouse was clearly noticeably missing a large number of boxes. Anxiety began to rise. Don't we need to cover up the signs that we took some of the boxes from the storage area? Maybe at least move the back rows forward? Or... Ed didn't have time to finish before Alex interrupted him irritably. "Are you serious? You think they won't notice the absence of several 100,000 worth of goods just because we move the back boxes closer to the exit? Don't be stupid. We have to leave right now. The man headed swiftly toward the car, and the boy followed. On the way back, Ed kept glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure no one was following them. After half an hour of such a disturbing environment, Alex exhaled convulsively and spoke confidently. It's okay. The case went just fine. No one set us up. No one discovered the opening of the warehouse. We can relax. We just have to unload these boxes at our boss's other warehouse, and then we can go back and report on the success of the case. I think we can even ask for a little more than usual for such a filigree performance. The man smiled contentedly, already anticipating the taste of money. Ed, on the other hand, couldn't relax. Unloading the boxes was harder than putting them in the car. The adrenaline level had already dropped, and there was a palpable fatigue. The last boxes were especially heavy, and after them the guy sat helplessly in the cab of the car, closing his eyes. His breathing was heavy, and it was hard not to notice it. Seeing the condition of his partner, Alex spoke in a calm voice. It will be difficult only at first, and then we will consider it as a simple job compared to loading cars or something similar. Believe me, I've tried my hand at a lot of jobs. This turned out to be one of the best for the money. Back from the case, Ed fell powerlessly on the bed in his den. Alex promised himself to tell his boss about the successful completion of the case. The guy was already falling into sleep when he heard a knock on his door, and the next second it opened. Opening his eyes, Ed saw Arthur, who was towering over him with a satisfied smile. Well done, boy. I didn't even doubt you. The case went well. Alex said that you worked as hard as he did, so your salary will be about the same as his. Of course, it'll get higher over the years as you gain experience and learn to drive. But even now, your salary is pretty good. The man held out an envelope. Ed sat down on the bed uncertainly, taking his paycheck. Opening the envelope, the boy looked at Arthur in surprise. The smile on his boss's face only grew wider. Yeah. What did you want? I promised to pay you well for doing your job. This is your paycheck for tonight. Good work. That's one night's pay? Edward said confusedly, counting the money again. I've gotten this much for a couple weeks of regular work, and this is for a few hours on a night out. You've got to be kidding me. What jokes? Son, it's your money. You can use it however you want. You did a good job. No one saw you, and all the boxes were delivered safely. I think Alex has already brought you up to speed, so you know exactly why you're getting such a large sum of money. Ed shook his head uncertainly. He still felt that he didn't know enough information to understand clearly where he was working. But on the other hand, after the amount of money he'd received, it was beginning to seem like it wasn't that big of a deal. All right, rest up. There are no new cases yet. From tomorrow, Alex will teach himself the peculiarities of driving a car, so that in case of need you can replace him. The next order will be in a few days. Arthur stood in silence for a few more seconds, then nodded some thoughts of his own and left the room. Ed counted the money a few more times, not quite sure why he had gotten such a large sum. His thoughts were darting around, not giving him any peace of mind. On the one hand, he had planned to leave after his first case, when he realized what his job actually entailed. But now. On the other hand, he could raise enough money in a few years to start a new life, to buy himself a small house away from this place, to get a chance to live happily ever after without poverty. After a few minutes of tossing about, Ed drifted off to sleep, and a few hours later he woke up with only one clear thought. It was worth going on. Since he'd gotten involved in this, since he'd become privy to all the not-so-legitimate matters and even managed to participate in them, there was no point in stopping right now. It was worth continuing now. It was worth at least trying to achieve something in life, even if it was by such dubious means. Edward worked like this for almost 5 years. He was in his 20s when he thought about giving up everything and starting to build a new life. He'd continued to live in a small apartment all these years so that he wouldn't have to spend money on rent, and he'd saved almost everything. He had accumulated a decent amount of money, and he expected that it would be enough to buy a house. But in life, rarely everything turns out exactly as planned, and the boy had learned this on his own skin. He warned Arthur that he was going on a final assignment, after which he wanted to leave. but the man had a very mixed reaction to the news. You realize you're just starting out in life, don't you? We can work for another 10 years and then live like never before. You'll never have to work again. You won't have to think about where to find money for a piece of bread. You're just beginning to taste that taste of freedom and independence, and now you're ready to give it all up so easily. That would be very foolish, son. Arthur's words were calm, but even so, there was a certain menace in them. But for 5 years of working for this man, Ed had already gotten used to the manner of communication. The guy calmly replied, "Yes, I understand everything perfectly well, but just while I'm young, I want to try something new. Maybe I can start my life with a clean slate and build a loving family. You know how long I've dreamed of that." Several times the guy shared his dreams and worries with his boss. Sometimes he wanted so much to pour out his soul to someone, to tell about his desires and worries, that it did not matter who was next to him. Arthur always supported the guy, gave him a chance to talk, but always stopped his thoughts about leaving his job. "I see," the man said thoughtfully, staring off into the distance. "Well, if that's your adult, informed decision, then so be it. If you ever change your mind, I'd be happy to take myself back. You've been a great employee. There were only a couple of times you and Alex got into some bad situations, but other than that, you performed perfectly. I hope your life works out the way you want it to." Even though the man's face remained calm, Edward sensed that something was wrong. It seemed that it wasn't just resentment, but something else. The boy nodded meekly, about to leave, when suddenly he heard it. "By the way, today's case is canceled. You'll go in a few days. You're not in such a hurry to leave us now, right?" "That's right. I'll do the last job as promised, and then I'll leave. Warn me in advance where the warehouse will be so I can explore the area as usual." After saying that, the guy walked out of the office. In the last couple of years, he had become especially responsible for his work after he and Alex had almost been caught for not knowing the streets in the city. Now, Ed always studied the area before going anywhere, and devoted a fair amount of time to the matter of exploring avenues of retreat. He didn't let things get unpredictable, knowing full well how it could end. Now he was behind the wheel at all times, for his own peace of mind. Alex didn't mind, because he had an opportunity to sleep sometimes on the road. On the day of the last order, the situation seemed especially tense to Ed. Alex hardly spoke to him, though lately he liked to talk about nothing, just to have a good time. Arthur didn't condescend to give instructions and tell him exactly what he had to do. After a couple hours on the road, the guy still decided to ask his partner about the case. "What's the matter? You seem tense, as if you thought nothing was going to happen. I haven't seen you like this in a long time." Edward glanced at his partner, noticing the way he exhaled convulsively, closing his eyes. There was a silence that seemed even more oppressive after the question. "You can tell me anything. You know I won't say a word to anyone about your problems, and you'll feel better if you do. Eddie, I'm not the problem. You're the one with the problem. I think this case is a little murky. We never went to the warehouses of the man we're going to now. I got a bad feeling about this. Come on, you and me, we've been all over the place. I guess it's just an opportunity to make another rich guy a little less rich. It's not going to be a big deal. Don't worry, everything's going to be fine. Have I ever let you down?" The guy looked at his partner carefully, but it seemed that he only became more tense from his words. "You don't understand. This isn't about you. We're on our way to one of the largest and most secure warehouses in the city right now. I don't think it's going to end as smoothly as we'd like. Admittedly, I even wanted to turn down the job. But when Arthur said he'd send you alone, I just couldn't do it." Alex became suddenly sadder and more depressed in an instant. "I've been to this warehouse before, but I never had time to take anything. As I tried to open the door, an alarm sounded. A dozen guards with dogs ran out to me. I barely got out of there in time, but I paid for that mistake for a long time. I think that after that time the security became even more thorough, because the warehouse has several tens of millions of dollars worth of goods. I wouldn't want your last case to be the last one you ever do." Alex exhaled sharply, and it sent shivers down Ed's spine. The man always cheered him up and talked about how any case could be conducted perfectly if you just tried to do it. But it turns out it couldn't. It's almost impossible to conduct a case perfectly, and the guy was convinced of that himself. Often there were minor misfires, but they were corrected quickly and quietly. Often the boss didn't even know about them. But if they were discovered, there would be serious consequences. Ed didn't ask anything else, looking carefully at the road and remembering all the routes he had worked out during the day. He understood perfectly well how and where to retreat. However, the anxiety was only getting worse. Something inside whispered that it was a mistake to set out on yet another case. But the guy had learned to silence the voice of his own mind and do anything to get the desired amount. But this situation was completely different, and soon Ed was convinced of it. Already on the approach to the warehouse, it began to seem that something was wrong. Only one narrow road that led to the imposing structure. Usually such places had better quality wide lines that allowed goods to be transported with minimal risk of spoilage. Ed tensed, realizing that there was no way to get back on that road quickly, and not in such a way as to keep the goods in perfect condition. It was always like this, Alex said, noticing the confused look on his partner's face. They don't make a good road just for such situations. It's impossible to get away quickly with the goods intact. His partner seemed to voice the thoughts that had been going through Edward's head all this time. Looking at Alex, the boy spoke up. Nothing. We've been down roads like this before. The important thing now is to keep things as quiet as possible so that there won't be any problems in the future. The men got out of the car. Alex started to open the lock on the storage room, and to his great surprise, it gave in easily. Alex looked puzzled at the guy who was watching his work carefully, and then with only one lip he spoke. Careful. Ed nodded, realizing that some warehouses might have sensors to detect intruders, and it would be worse to run into them than just the guards. After all, in that case, the doors might automatically close. Ed looked inside, marveling at the number of boxes of merchandise that were racked up all over the place. As he started carrying them to the car, he was surprised at how heavy they were. After an hour, he couldn't bring himself to keep working. Ed, this is no time to rest. We've got to get them in the car as soon as possible and get the hell out of here. There's still a third more to move. Come on, move it. Alex was already getting into the car box by box, realizing that procrastination would do no good. Ed forced himself to rise to his feet again, but no sooner had the guy made a step when suddenly he heard a dog barking and hasty approaching footsteps. He, stunned, looked toward the warehouse that Alex had just entered, waiting for him to appear. The man was carrying 2 boxes at once, seeing Edward's stunned look. The sounds grew closer, and Alex dropped the boxes to the floor, rushing forward. The man had no more strength for such a dash, so he shouted to his partner, "Get in the car. If they stop the car, we'll never pay you back for the rest of our lives." For a couple of seconds, Ed stared at the man, who was only a couple of dozen meters away from him, but he couldn't run. There were excited voices and growls. At that moment, Edward realized that he couldn't stay where he was. He rushed to the car, starting it up and hoping that his partner would still be able to make it to the cabin. But he could already see the strangers in the rear mirror. There was no longer an option to stay put. Ed pressed the gas pedal to the floor, seeing Alex being sat down on the floor, holding his hands behind his back. What was going to happen to his partner now? Several boxes spilled out of the cab of the car due to the abrupt start. A few more were left on the road as the guy was trying to overcome a very bumpy terrain. It was only after he'd gotten out of the city and away from the chase that Edward was able to stop to take stock of the situation. He got out of the car, examining what was left inside. God willing, at least half of the merchandise was intact after what had happened. But what about Alex? What would happen to him now? A lump came to the guy's throat, but he forced himself to relax, realizing perfectly well that panic would not be the solution. He looked around, locking the car and wondering what he should say to his boss now. "How could you leave him alone out there?" shouted Arthur at the guy. The man paced from side to side as if wondering what to say next. It was the first time Edward had ever seen him so annoyed, and it made the boy uncomfortable. He watched the man carefully, trying to figure out what to do, but he couldn't think of anything to do. Do you realize that he's several times more important than you are? How could you just leave him alone in this hellhole? All you think about is your ass. You're a petty, worthless boy whose value was only in the fact that he was a masterful listener to his mentor, who is now gone through your own fault. The man shouted the last phrase practically in the boy's face. It sent an unpleasant wave of goosebumps down Ed's back. He hadn't felt this unpleasant feeling in a long time, and now he just didn't know what to do about it. If I left, we'd have absolutely no product. And here we have at least half of what we were planning to pick up, Ed said, trying to make the situation less tense. Besides, Alex had told me to leave, because he realized that the situation couldn't be resolved any other way. I waited for him until the last minute. But you could have held those people off so Alex could escape. No? But then I would have had to stay there, Ed said in a depressed voice. He knew perfectly well that it would have been impossible for both of them to escape, and he didn't want to be in Alex's shoes when he still had his whole life ahead of him. Alex had made his own decision. The boy spoke in a more confident voice, trying to keep himself in front of his boss. I don't give a damn about your decisions. You have to follow my orders. The strictness and aggression of the boss's voice made him uncomfortable. The guy lowered his head, realizing that he could not change the man's mind, and therefore it remained only to wait for the final verdict. Arthur continued to pacing from side to side as he suddenly spoke. You will give me back all the money. Give me the money for all the goods to the last cent, and on top of that, the same amount for your lost partner. The man wrote something quickly on a piece of paper and handed it to Edward. And this is the amount you'll owe me now. And don't even try to hide from me, or you'll only get worse. Do you understand? Ed hesitantly took the piece of paper from his boss's hands, realizing with horror that it was almost all the money he'd put away in 5 years of steady work. The guy's gaze grew heavy and strained. No one knew how much money he really had, and so he decided to go on the sly, hoping that he would have some chance to start a new life. Edward muttered in a depressed voice. But I only have half of that amount, and where am I going to find as much more if I have 5 years' worth of money set aside? The guy looked up at his boss, hoping to see a bit of sympathy in his gaze, but instead he got a hateful and cold look from the man. I don't care where you get the money. As of today, you don't work for me anymore. I don't need people like you. You know, after 5 years, I was beginning to think you were the best worker. No. Turns out you only care about your own skin, willing to betray the closest people in your life. I don't need that kind of man. So I don't see any point in continuing to hold on, waiting for you to throw everything at me to get as much money as possible. The man was silent for a few seconds and then added, You have until the end of the week. I don't care what you do or where you look for the money, but it has to be there. If you try to hide, I'll find you anyway. Just so you know. After saying that, Arthur rose from his seat, pointing to the door. Edward slowly made his way to his cell, realizing that his life would never be the same again. All night long, the guy was tormented by horrible dreams about what might have happened to his partner. He literally could not close his eyes for a minute, because his imagination again and again drew not the most pleasant pictures, which became really creepy. After a few hours, the guy completely abandoned any attempts to sleep and began to think about what to do. The guilt didn't let him relax for a minute. It seemed like all of this could have been avoided. Stop it, came the voice of his partner in the guy's head. It's not your fault. I made this decision on my own. I'm glad you're okay. The boy opened his eyes abruptly, realizing that he had fallen asleep on the floor. The cold surface seemed to squeeze his mind, which made him feel better. He rose from the floor, looking at the scattered things he had intended to collect. Fortunately, he hadn't accumulated much in 5 years, because Edward preferred not to buy anything unnecessary. He had only one wish, to escape as quickly as possible and start a new life. All of his boss's threats seemed unrealistic. Would he be able to find him in another city? Would he be able to figure out where the guy was going if he just changed his documents? Could everything happen the way the boss said it would? The questions were on his mind, but Edward didn't have an answer to any of them. He realized that he wasn't ready to give up everything he'd gained over the years. There was only one option, to try to escape as quickly as possible, not to look back on the past and try to start a whole new life. Edward hurriedly packed his things and went outside. He looked around quickly, realizing that there was no one around. He quickly looked around, realizing that no one was around. It was completely silent the whole time. Once outside the territory of the place where he had spent the last 5 years of his life, the guy seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. He realized that everything was going to change now. He would never go back to what he had been doing again, and he would never get involved in any murky business again. But it wasn't that simple, and getting out of a coma of trouble seemed almost impossible. Ed got to the train station quite quickly. He caught the first cab he could to get far away. With a strain in his voice, the guy mumbled, "Let's go to some other city, any place, just far away from here. There's money, I'll pay you. Just let's not take too long." Ed looked at the cab driver, who remained completely unruffled, as if he'd been approached every day with such a request. The man behind the wheel nodded, beginning the route. Ed stared at the houses floating outside the window for a few minutes, but afterward he closed his eyes in an attempt to get some rest. The unbelievable fatigue and pain came with renewed force. He wanted to forget, wanted to just fall into oblivion and stop torturing himself. And for a moment he actually succeeded in doing so. But as soon as his eyelids fluttered open, he regretted his desire to rest. The car stopped near the very spot from which Ed had escaped with such eagerness. With a look of horrified incomprehension, the lad spoke quickly. "What are we doing here? I told you to take me to another town. Shut your mouth." The man behind the wheel of the car spoke harshly, and that's when Ed realized it wasn't as simple as he might have thought. A few seconds later, two of Arthur's guards, whom the guy knew, approached the car. He opened the car doors sharply and tried to rush out, but before he could take a step, a rough male hand grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. A feeling of utter hopelessness and fear came over him with renewed vigor. He realized that now it would not end so easily. They dragged him into an unfamiliar room without giving him the slightest opportunity to justify himself. The guard sat the boy on a chair and then left. There was the sound of a latch. Ed realized he couldn't get out. After a few minutes, it became difficult to breathe. There seemed to be no air left in the windowless room. He began to feel dizzy and nauseous, and the feeling of nausea grew stronger with each passing second. At the moment when the boy began to think that he was going to lose consciousness, the doors to the room opened. On the threshold was Arthur, who looked at his former subordinate with displeasure. The man didn't step into the room. He nodded to the guards at the boy, who was already in a semi-fainting state, and they dragged him into the office of the boss, who Ed knew well. "I warned you not to even try to run. That, as you can see, didn't end well. You should have thought twice before making such a stupid decision. My men are everywhere. My eyes and ears will even be in your bed until you pay me back every last dime you owe me. And forget it. I don't forgive any offense, especially one as serious as the one you committed. I just wanted to make some money, and then I'd show up." The boy whispered helplessly, making every effort to sit up straight. "I wasn't planning to run away or hide. I was just looking for another job. Don't try to lie to me. I'm well aware of how people like you solve problems. I'm going to keep you in this town under my watch until you get your money back. And if I see one more attempt to escape on your part, the next time I see you, it won't be in my office." A shadow of threat flickered in the man's voice, which Edward picked up on instantly. Edward realized that he wouldn't be able to live peacefully until he paid off his former boss. The fear became inhuman. And at that moment, the man spoke out. "One more attempt to escape and you will never be able to run again. And that's the least of the evils that can happen in your life." Arthur nodded to the guards walking out of his office. The men stayed behind the boy. Ed felt threatened by them but continued to sit in his chair, realizing that he just didn't have the strength to get up from it. The guy felt himself slowly sinking into oblivion, but he couldn't help it. Everything swam in front of his eyes. The nausea was receding into the background. His head felt heavy, and for a moment he felt an incredible relief. Waking up, Ed realized that the guards were still standing behind him. They seemed like silent statues who would be silent to the last man, but would do everything in their power to please the boss if necessary. Overcoming fatigue and pain, the boy rose from his chair. His legs felt like cotton. Everything inside was clenching in some unpleasant cramps. It seemed that he had received a very serious poisoning, the consequences of which would not be pleasant for several days. Ed slowly wandered toward the exit of the office, but one of the guards blocked his way. He stopped a few centimeters away from him, saying, "You're not supposed to. Sit down." The man again began to look somewhere in the distance and seemed to pay absolutely no attention to the guy, who remained on his feet just from the last strength. Ed realized that it was pointless to argue, and so he slowly returned to his former place. Putting his head down on the cold table, he felt some relief, covering his eyes. All he had to do was wait for what would happen next. A few minutes later, a man walked into the office. Without turning around, just by the sound of his footsteps and the scent of perfume, Ed realized it was his former boss. "How are you feeling, Edward? I didn't realize you could disappoint me so much by doing something like that. But it'll teach you a lesson, lad. Never forget your own debts and try to run away from your problems. They'll always catch up with you, no matter what you do. So I suggest you do your best to find the money I need from you." Arthur stopped beside Ed. Leaning on the table, he stared at the boy for a few seconds, after which he continued speaking. "And also, son, you must realize that for every mistake there will be a reckoning. There is no such thing as being praised for your misdeeds, and therefore you will have to give me an amount twice as much as the original. You hear me, don't you?" Ed slowly opened his eyes. The man's words seemed distant, and the meaning didn't come through right away. But the moment the boy realized what was wanted from him, he opened his eyes sharply, rising on his elbows with the last of his strength. He looked at his former boss with incomprehension, asking him, "But where am I supposed to find that amount of money? I couldn't do it even if I wanted to. Take everything I have, all the money I have, but I can't give you anything else. I have no job, no home, nothing that would allow me to live normally, not survive. You're taking the last of it. Where am I going to get more?" Ed looked pleadingly at Arthur, but the man remained completely calm and adamant. He shrugged, in the same measured tone of voice. "And I don't care where you get the money. It's entirely your problem, son. You just have to give it to me. And don't worry about your savings. We've already taken it for the debt. But you need as much more and you have less and less time." Well, well, well. Arthur left the office, followed by the guards. For a few more minutes, Ed lay on the table, not knowing what to do or how to go on living. But the realization that it was worth doing anything to solve the problem was so clear that it was even frightening. Edward could only bring himself to leave the room after several hours. The nausea never fully let go, and so the guy made the decision to go to the nearest hospital. His appearance spoke volumes, and that's why they didn't want to take him in initially. Sitting in the corridor and waiting for the moment when he was invited to the office, Ed began to feel how slowly he was losing consciousness. At that moment, a nurse ran up to him and held him so the man wouldn't fall off the table. She panicked. "Oh my God, what's wrong with you? What am I supposed to do if you pass out?" The girl started to bring the guy back to consciousness, and Ed was able to open his eyes. And that's when he saw the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen in his life. It was love at first sight, which the guy never believed in. But now he experienced it on his own skin. He looked at the girl and didn't understand why he had never seen her in this place before. "You." He only managed to speak as he continued to stare at the nurse. "Lana, I'm new here. I just got here a couple weeks ago to start a new life. And it's working out pretty well so far. I just can't get used to the fact that everyone knows me and I know no one." The girl smiled radiantly. Ed felt himself fainting. He covered his eyes, trying to regain his inner strength. But this attempt had no effect, and the guy sank into oblivion. When he opened his eyes, he saw in front of him the same girl he had seen before he lost consciousness. She was smiling, looking at the guy coming to his senses. Moving closer, the girl spoke up. "It's good that you've come to your senses. I was beginning to worry. You had a little poisoning, but now the condition has stabilized. I'll be able to discharge you in a couple days." Lana looked him straight in the eye, and in that moment, he felt a sense of purpose. He felt that he wanted to protect her, wanted to be near her, and make the girl's life easier and more joyful. But could he become that while he couldn't solve his own problems? Would it be fair to drag the girl into his problems? The harsh reality overrode all good things. The guy's gaze immediately became heavy, but he didn't hold back his thoughts. "You are so beautiful," the guy barely audible. But Lana heard it anyway. "I just can't tell you how attractive you are. I would like to see your beautiful face every day. I wish I could wake up next to you. Wish you were there." Edward reached out his hand, gently touching the girl. Lana flinched but didn't pull away, looking at the man carefully. "I liked you too," she whispered after a few moments of pause. There was an instant chemistry between the couple that threatened to grow into something more in a minimum of time. And that's exactly what happened. Ed had only been in the hospital for a day, and the entire time Lana had stayed by his side. At the discharge, the boy confidently said. "I will definitely come for you as soon as I solve all my problems. Okay? Give me some time. We'll definitely be fine." Edward gently held the girl's hands in his, either reassuring her or reassuring himself. He could feel his heart breaking into small pieces. He just couldn't drag her into his problems. He just couldn't allow himself to do that to her. After all she'd done for him. Ed gently ran his thumb along the girl's arm. "You should stay in the hospital for at least a couple more days. Your condition is just awful. Not all the toxins are gone yet. I have no idea what you've been breathing in and where, that it's that bad." The girl's voice sounded worried. "Don't stay for me. Stay for your own health, please. I wouldn't want you to get worse because of a decision made too abruptly to go home. Please." The girl's voice trembled, and at that moment something inside Ed tingled unpleasantly. He closed his eyes, trying to keep his composure, and spoke. "I'm sorry. I'll tell you everything, but only after I've solved all the problems. We're going to be fine. Just trust me, okay?" Lana nodded uncertainly. She couldn't even imagine what kind of problems Edward was facing, or how he was going to solve them. Ed walked out of the hospital, still completely unaware of what awaited him. He began to think frantically about where he could get a large sum of money in just the few days he had left for the rest of the week. There was not a single sensible thought in his head. As the guy walked through the village, he looked around, hoping to come up with something worthwhile. Walking down another street, the boy's gaze fell on a very appealing house. It was a huge 2-story structure that drew attention from all sides of the village. It immediately stood out from the general view. And at that moment the first more or less sensible idea appeared in the boy's mind. He approached the house, hoping that the wealthy widow would have a job for him. But he had no idea what awaited him. But in his mind there was no other solution anyway. After a few minutes of hesitation, the boy rang the doorbell. No one answered for a suspiciously long time, and no sound came from inside. Edward thought for a moment that no one was going to answer, but then he heard the sound of the lock opening. He took a step back, and at that moment the doors opened. A very well-groomed old woman stood on the threshold and looked at the boy with incomprehension. After a few seconds she asked, "Did you want something?" Ed was confused at the sight of such a well-groomed, attractive older woman in a place where half of them don't even live to such an advanced age. After a few seconds of complete silence, when Edward realized she was already getting awkward, he took a step forward to shorten the distance and spoke confidently. "Good afternoon. I would like to offer you my services. I can do any work you need me to do around the yard and the house." The guy spoke confidently, trying to make the best impression. He looked at the old woman carefully, noticing how she was looking at him without shyness. "Only I will need to get some part of the advance payment before I start the work. I'm conscientious, responsible, and hardy." Ed fell silent, not sure how to advertise himself at all. It seemed like a completely stupid idea, and not worth bothering the older man. But in the next few seconds, the man was greatly surprised by the old lady's words. "I don't need you and your services as a laborer. I have enough men that I understand." The old woman was silent, and at that moment, Ed realized that his plan had failed completely. He was about to leave with his head down, when suddenly the old woman added, "But I can pay a pretty penny for something else. Become my husband." The old woman looked at the boy carefully, waiting for his answer. Edward hadn't expected such an offer. He expected to hear anything, but not that kind of answer, and so he didn't know what to say. He stared at the old woman with incomprehension. "Excuse me, how do you envision it? You do realize that I can't fulfill all the responsibilities of marriage, right? I just can't. I just can't." Edward felt like he'd completely forgotten how to put words into sentences, and he didn't know what to say to his grandmother in the doorway. "Don't worry, I'm not asking you to do your marital duty. I just need you to be my husband at a class reunion in a couple days, and then you can do whatever you want. Just one meeting. You have to behave like a real husband, treating me like one. After that, you get all the money you need and you're free to go." Ed looked at the old woman in bewilderment, not understanding how she imagined such a situation. But the offer was attractive enough. After a few seconds of hesitation, he spoke in a confident voice. "Okay. But how are we going to get married in time? The queues at the registry offices are huge, and we only have a couple of days left. Besides, you haven't even asked me how much money I need, so what if you can't give it to me?" Ed doubted that he would be able to get exactly what he needed for a couple days of acting. He pulled out of his pocket a piece of paper he'd had in his pocket since Arthur had told him the amount. Holding the piece of paper out to the old woman, he expected her to refuse. But the woman said, "My dear, I can pay any amount, and once again, I have so much money that I can afford anything. So don't underestimate me. Don't worry about the signing. I have a lot of people who would be happy to do it, but you just need to look presentable so that my girlfriends believe that you are my husband and not just a guy from the back street." The preparations were in full swing. Edward went into town that afternoon to put together a full-fledged look for the meeting. He spent a long time choosing a suitable outfit, realizing that it should look rich, but not flashy. He had to update his hair, work on his demeanor, and even learn all the habits of his future wife, so as not to get into an awkward situation when talking. Mrs. Jane, the name of the old woman who was willing to pay for the marriage, had made up the story of their acquaintance and everything about her husband. Edward only had to play his part perfectly, so that no one would guess what was really behind the perfect mask. He had to repeat several times all the facts of the story and invented moments, so as not to be confused in the process of the meeting. And in the end, the guy remembered everything perfectly. The play began. The day of the meeting came unexpectedly quickly. Edward spent a long time getting ready, styling his hair and working out his gait. He wanted to fit in perfectly with high society. Mrs. Jane watched him all the while, realizing that her plan was perfect. Just before she left, she spoke up. "If you do everything perfectly, I'll pay you even more than you wanted. The main thing is not to give away that you've only known me for a couple of days, or that you're my husband just for the money. If anything goes wrong, you won't get paid at all. You'll have to pay for the suit, too." Ed nodded obediently. He knew very well what people with great financial wealth were like. He sighed heavily and pulled on a smile, trying his best to look as good as possible for his wife. The meeting was going smoothly enough. There wasn't much conversation, but everyone was clearly paying attention to the unusual couple who had become the center of attention. Edward stayed close to his wife, fixing her shawl and offering her cocktails and appetizers. There were more and more whispers behind her back, but the boy was sure he was just playing his part perfectly. He knew everything about Mrs. Jane and easily answered all the questions her friends had. The perfect preparation did not fail. Everyone believed that the guy was really her legal spouse. In the midst of the meeting, Edward decided to go outside to get some fresh air. Edward was not feeling well after the poisoning, and the lack of sleep was affecting him even more. It seemed that he was going to faint a little more. And so, deciding not to risk it, he just went out into the fresh air, not knowing yet what awaited him. A few minutes later, a girl, quite attractive, came out onto the balcony. She stopped a meter away from the guy, leaning on the railing. There was complete silence for a few seconds, after which the girl spoke confidently. "Don't you want to have a great evening without your old lady? It seems to me that it will be possible to spend time with me much more pleasantly, handsome." The girl looked at Edward defiantly, but he wasn't interested. Continuing to stare off into the distance, he spoke calmly. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in your proposal. I love my wife, and I'll spend the night with her at our house." Ed said it so calmly that he was surprised. He used to be excited by such attractive girls, but now only the image of Lana stood in his mind. She was the ideal for him, the epitome of the girl he wanted to be with and was ready to have by his side. Sighing tiredly, he wanted to go back into the room, realizing that the stranger was eating him up with her gaze. But she wouldn't let him. Abruptly grabbing the man's hand, she came close to him, speaking in a languid voice in his ear. "You have no idea what you're giving up. I'm sure I'm much better than your grandmother, and you'll just love a night with me. Come on, no one's gonna know about this. Just know that you want me here and now." The girl tried to press her body against Edward's, but he took a sharp step back, pushing the stranger away from him. He looked at the girl hatefully, and then he spoke in an annoyed voice without breaking eye contact. "I would ask you not to spoil such a beautiful evening I had planned to spend with my spouse. I'm sure there are many men among the guests who would be willing to spend the evening with you, but I'm not one of them. Good night." Ed turned around to leave again, but at that moment the stranger with poisonous notes in her voice said, "Well, let's see how happy you'll be to spend the evening with your wife when her son, who didn't even know you existed, arrives." The damsel smiled smugly, realizing that she was in an advantageous position. I know him well, and he will not simply leave the fact that some young guy married his mother and is trying to get more money from her. That's what you need her for, isn't it? You're just trying to make a buck, and there's no real love there. Who are you trying to fool, boy? The girl smiled wryly as she walked past him, swaying her hips. You could have just left with me, and then your problem would have solved itself. But since you've made the decision to stay, good luck dealing with all the problems that have arisen. Maybe next time you'll think before you upset a pretty girl. Mrs. Jane had said nothing to Edward about her son, so the boy didn't hesitate to return to her in the hall. He put his arm around the woman, still playing his role of caring spouse perfectly. But something inside was screaming that he should leave as soon as possible. And the gut feeling didn't fail. A few minutes later, a heavy hand was laid on his shoulder, and then he was sharply turned around, and he had no time to see anything, only felt a sharp pain, after which he found himself in oblivion. Darkness, silence, calm. It all seemed so blissful that he didn't want to open his eyes. But gradually the sensations began to return. His head ached incredibly, and his throat felt dry. He forced himself to open his eyes with incredible effort, and realized he was in a hospital. Looking around, the guy sighed, realizing that the person he was most afraid to see was sitting in the chair beside him, his former boss. "Mr. Arthur?" Edward whispered, but it was enough to make the man open his eyes. "I still have time. You gave me until the end of the week. I'll have the money by the end of the day today." "I guess so." The last memory came back to the boy's mind. Was it possible that he had played his part perfectly? Or did the fall and the loss of consciousness not belong to him? Would he be paid anything now? Or was it all for nothing? "Edward, I knew you were a smart guy, of course, but I never imagined you'd agree to my mother's gamble. I'm sorry for what happened, but my guard managed to accomplish the task before I spoke to my mother. You yourself realized that I had to protect my mother from a possible Alfonso who just wanted to profit from her gullibility and loneliness." And then it all began to come together in Edward's mind. That's how the old woman had so much money, even though no one had ever seen where she worked. That's why she didn't worry about the amount the boy had asked for. She knew that her son would give it to her with ease. Edward looked up at his former boss. "I had no idea it was your mom. I would never have done that if I could have imagined she was your mother. I would never." The guy tried to gather his thoughts, but at that moment, the dizziness came with renewed force. The boy closed his eyes tightly as Arthur spoke. "Calm down, son. You did the right thing in trying to earn money to pay me back. Mother showed me the very piece of paper I once wrote to you. You didn't try to take too much and just wanted to pay me back. You might have made a good family man, but not with my mother. Although I must admit, you made her happy. Everyone talked about how beautiful she was and how lucky she was to have a husband. Some were so jealous that they said you were only with her for the money. Although, of course, that was true. That was a fine performance, son. It was time to pay up." The man pulled Edward's passport, which had been in his pocket all this time, out of his pocket. Holding it out to the boy, he spoke. "Consider your debt officially cleared. You can start your life with a clean slate. Goodbye. It was a pleasure working with you." Without waiting for the guy's reply, Arthur quickly left the room, realizing that there was no point in staying there any longer. A few minutes had passed when suddenly Lana flew into it. She immediately jumped to the guy, pulling him to her with all her might. "I was so worried that something might have happened to you. You're a fool who just disappeared thinking that." The girl couldn't finish. Edward pulled her sharply to him, reveling in her lips with a long-awaited kiss. Mrs. Jane could not leave things as they were. She went to the hospital to visit her husband and heard a woman moaning outside his room. Looking in, she saw a young nurse right on top of Edward. She was well aware that the young men were completely oblivious to her, and so she simply left the room, waiting for it to be over. After a few minutes, Lana left the room quickly, flinching at the sight of the old woman. She realized that she had seen and heard everything, so she lowered her head and hurried away. Mrs. Jane entered the room to see her husband. When Edward saw her, he tried to rise but could not do so. "It's all right, darling. Lie down. You need to get your strength back. My son told me all about you. I had no idea you'd come to me out of desperation. I thought you were just another loser looking for easy money. I think I should have told you in person that you are now officially a free man and that you can do anything you want." The old lady held out the document of dissolution of marriage. "If you want, my acquaintances will make it so that your passport will not have a stamp that reminds you of our little adventure." The woman smiled. She looked at the guy for a few seconds and then took out a small envelope from her bag and handed it to Ed. "I know that we've settled your debt, but it seems to me that you deserve to be compensated for the moral damage." Ed looked into the envelope. There were several large bills, enough for a few months of decent living. "You can make a fresh start. Good luck to you." The woman smiled and left the room. Edward had indeed started life with a clean slate, but he never dared to leave his home village. There were so many memories there, even good ones at times. He couldn't quite explain why the burning desire to leave was replaced by a strange longing at the mere thought of moving. Edward proposed to Lana after a couple of months, and the girl agreed to become his wife. A guy's most cherished dream had come true: to build a family. And it turned out to be the best reward for all the trials he had gone through.